A new bill quietly introduced by Congress last week is causing quite a stir among civil liberties groups. The brainchild of Senators John McCain and Joe Lieberman. The bill would give the U.S. government the power to indefinitely detain terror suspects without charge or trial and to interrogate them for their quote-unquote intelligence value. And it doesn't make a distinction between U.S. citizens and non-citizens. So does this sound kind of scary to you? Well, joining us now to talk about that is RT's Lucy Kavanaugh. Lucy, hello. So some concerns. I mean, this is kind of a no-duh question, I guess, but there are some concerns. And what are the concerns here?
Yeah, well, I mean, people see this as yet another example of overreaction by the government in the name of national security. I mean, the frightening thing about this legislation is that it effectively gives the U.S. military the right to detain American citizens in the name of national security with, absolutely no recourse to correct the situation if someone was, for example, detained in error. The bill is worded so broadly that it basically could, throw you or I or anyone into jail for being perceived as the war on terror. And it doesn't really set any limits in terms of who makes the decision about that perception. And so, if, say, we speak out really strongly against a government and it's somehow perceived as being a threat to the United States, we can see ourselves locked up, held by the military, interrogated, held indefinitely, and all without a basic right to, an attorney or a public trial, and et cetera. It also begs the question of what happens when you detain someone in error, and also what happens, what mechanisms are in place to prevent this from being politically used in a politicized sort of way. I mean, could we see this legislation used to stifle dissent? I mean, Tea Partiers often say fairly critical things of the U.S. government. In its extreme, could we see this legislation used as something to stifle that kind of dissent? What about 9/11 truthers? What about anti-war protesters? And so, the question is limits and oversight, and this legislation, unfortunately, doesn't set any limits, and it doesn't really, allow any process for these kinds of decisions to be overseen in a system of checks and balances.
What about people who just simply come on and say, God, I hate this country? I mean, and even they maybe could be, because of the broad language, broad scope of the language which you had brought up earlier, they could even potentially be, I guess, put on this watch list by the government.
Well, I mean, that's the threat, and that's always the problem that you have when lawmakers legislate out of panic. I mean, we've seen the reaction to the Christmas Day bomber and the guy that drove the airplane into the IRS building. We had the Pentagon shooter, and I think, Congress is a very, very reactive body. And a lot of times when something happens that scares Americans, a lawmaker says, okay, hey, this is a frightening situation. I'm up for re-election. I want to look like I'm being really tough on terrorism and like I'm standing up to the terrorists. And so there's this rush to sort of, quickly legislate without thinking through a piece of legislation. And a lot of times we end up subverting values that we take for granted in this country, like democracy and freedom, in the name of national security. And I think, Americans definitely want the government to be proactive in terms of, addressing the terror threat, but I don't remember going to the polls and voting to, take away my constitutional rights. Do you?
We have just about a minute left, but you brought the examples of the, I call him the Underoos bomber, and also Joe Stack. But because of events like those, incidents like those, isn't there kind of a need for a piece of legislation like this?
Well, again, legislation like this is done out of fear and out of panic, and it's not thought through. The consequences of this, I mean, when you look at the domestic terror threat, a lot of folks, and I'm not justifying this, I mean, any sort of violence is completely inexcusable, but a lot of people are, trending towards violent reactions to what they perceive as a loss of their liberties to the federal government. And something like this is not going to win you any friends by people who already feel like they're sacrificing their rights and liberties in the name of terror, And the ironic thing is you'd think that this would be maybe a partisan issue where Democrats or Republicans would be different on this. And unfortunately, with things like this, both parties seem to work in lock and step. I mean, we saw the passage of the Patriot Act with virtually no debate last week. And, I don't know if this thing is going to pass, but again, there's just very little difference between the two parties on an issue like this.
RT's Lucy Kavanaugh. We will see if this thing passes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.